I'm Chris Hardy. I'm with the National Security Division here at the Department of Justice. The National Security Division oversees, among other things, the department's prosecution of crimes relating to terrorism. We work closely with the FBI in terrorism investigations and with the intelligence community. These include crimes involving international terrorism, such as committed by groups such as ISIS, and also domestic terrorism. Terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are hate groups. They all advocate anti-Semitic violence. We're committed to using our counterterrorism tools and our expertise to counter terrorist violence that is inspired by hate. We work closely with the criminal division, where crimes involving hate also involve terrorism, including domestic terrorism. So the topic of this panel is how to combat anti-Semitism consistent with the First Amendment. Our experience with respect to the First Amendment issues is on the terrorism side, so I'd like to offer our perspective on the legal and policy frameworks that we've developed to counter terrorism. We have powerful authorities on the terrorism side with respect to international terrorism, so adhering to First Amendment limitations is an important part, and ensuring that the IC does is an important part of the National Security Division's mission, because NSD, we not only help prosecute cases involving terrorism and other threats to national security, but we perform an important oversight role with respect to the FBI's activities and also the intelligence community's activities under surveillance laws and surveillance statutes. So I'll explain our approach in connection with investigations and prosecutions involving terrorist conduct, and also explain a little bit about how we've looked at approaching terrorist use of the internet specifically, and hopefully those frameworks will inform this discussion. So a core principle guiding the department, and including the FBI and also the intelligence community under guidelines that apply to FBI's intelligence activities and also its domestic law enforcement activities, is you cannot open an investigation or monitor conduct based solely on protected speech, speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. But we can investigate, and this is important, we can investigate individuals where their conduct, which may include speech online, demonstrates a threat of violence, other criminal conduct, or a threat to national security. It is our policy, especially since 9/11, to be proactive in identifying terrorist threats before they cause harm, particularly so for threats that would involve violence against groups within the United States. So we need to balance those two things. We need to be proactive in identifying threats and also respect the First Amendment. We can't just monitor conduct, including conduct online, unless we have a reason to do so in a particular case. So although one's beliefs, no matter how abhorrent, are protected by the First Amendment, we can take action where an individual engages in conduct that constitutes an imminent threat of violence or incitement to violence or solicitation of a crime. And we have examples of cases where we've pursued those types of cases over the years, including the Revolution Muslim case back in 2012 and others. With respect to social media, this has been a significant focus of not just the Department of Justice, but the government overall after the rise of ISIS, and there was a lot of attention paid to it in 2015. We're seeing some of the same types of policy and legal issues come up in the foreign interference context with respect to Russian interference online and those types of issues. So it's not a problem that's just a terrorism problem. We're seeing, as groups use social media and the internet to foster violence and to build their networks and their groups, and the communications networks that they're using are largely domestically based or reach a domestic audience. It raises important First Amendment and legal policy issues about the scope of our investigative authorities and the proper role of the intelligence community. So this is something we're seeing across the board. So our terrorism investigations, they often involve the use of social media along with, together with encrypted messaging apps. Often the model that ISIS perfected back in 2015 and on was broadcasting messages, exhorting members to violence using public available social media, and then encouraging potential operatives to go offline through encrypted messaging channels. And we're seeing that playbook, you will see it replicated by other types of groups, including domestic groups. So in addition to investigating potential crimes consistent with the First Amendment, as I just discussed, we've worked with, given the limitations on our authorities and the proper role of the government, we've worked with the tech sector to help the government, help the public combat the problem of terrorism. So, social media companies, they are not limited by the First Amendment and the way the government is limited. Their terms of use are going to prohibit a far broader range of conduct than could be prescribed under criminal laws. So the approach that we've developed with respect to terrorist use of the internet is to develop close working relationships with the major providers. And that is something that model is one that we would likely follow with respect to foreign interference using social media and other types of problems that raise the similar types of issues that we confronted in the terrorism context. So the government, where we have information from a predicated investigation, we're not just monitoring the internet, we can share that threat information with providers. We can provide and do provide threat briefings to providers, and it helps the providers voluntarily use their own efforts to enforce their own terms of service, to improve their own algorithms, improve their own processes for identifying content that is threatening. So that is something that we have been doing since 2015. It is something that we will be doing in connection with foreign interference as well, as I just discussed. And that model has been, we think, effective. We've seen providers taking down. We don't make generally do not make requests for providers to take down specific posts or specific content, but we will provide threat briefings. We'll provide information to the providers so they can more effectively monitor their own systems consistent with their own terms of service. But we've seen success from encouraging providers to be responsible with respect to monitoring their platforms. Twitter has, I think last year, took down something like 165,000 accounts associated with terrorism. Facebook, I think the report was last year, they removed something like 14 million pieces of terrorist content, largely related to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And now we've seen Facebook enforcing policies with respect to white extremist, nationalist groups, violent groups. So that's the framework with which we've approached terrorist use of the internet. But it points to, whether it's terrorist use of the internet using domestic, largely domestic platforms like Facebook or Twitter, or foreign interference, the same thing. The policy issue that we confront is historically, our authorities on the intelligence side they're constrained because they generally look outside the United States and at particular designated groups. So you can share information, but you're not doing it based on monitoring the internet in the United States. You're seeing, if you have surveillance on a group outside the United States, you're seeing connections to that group and their activities that might identify individuals in the United States that then could lead to a predicated investigation that might lead to information that you could then share. But the issues are very different when you're talking about purely domestic groups and domestic conduct in terms of the authorities that we can bring to bear, and they raise different policy issues about what the proper role of the government is. So it's very important, in light of some of those limitations, for the government to have strong partnerships with civil society, private sector. It's very important to the work that Memory is doing, and we can be partners. And there's nothing we can speak as the government to providers. We can message to providers as we do in the terrorism context, so long as we're not being threatening or coercive or demanding that they take action. And that is a proper role for the government. We have been doing that in the terrorism context, and that can inform the approach domestically. But there are, I think, more significant First Amendment issues and limitations on the government's conduct when you're talking about domestic speech than international terrorism. So that's the framework that we've been following in those areas.